And number 5, Paul says when this is all done well, when there's edification happening, when it's done in an orderly manner, when you're following the leading of the Spirit, then your church meeting is a reflection of the character of God. God is a God of order. We see that in Genesis as God creates the world. He's a God of order. He took chaos and he created a world of beauty. And God is a God of peace. And Paul says that when your meetings do these things, you reflect the very character of God in your meeting. And he emphasizes that in verse 33. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. Paul says this is the one thing that we all have in common. We all meet in different places. We all do different things. We all maybe emphasize different gifts. But there's one thing that all the Lord's congregations have in common. We are orderly and we are peaceful. The negative things about this system, however, that the people in Corinth were experiencing. 1, it did not prevent excess, as this lady seems to be struggling with. And so what was happening in Corinth were tongues were getting a little bit excessive and the prophecies were getting a little bit excessive. And some behavior was perhaps getting a little bit excessive. And so Paul was saying, so we've got these good things happening, but there's a couple of correctives that need to be. And so we need to correct this excess that's happening. The other negative thing is that it didn't prevent people from using the service for their own ends. And God could be disregarded. And so Paul says we need to bring in a couple of controls here to make sure that God is the one being honored and that people aren't trying to show off their own super spirituality by the way that they're behaving. Therefore, Paul provided some guidelines. And the first guideline is that tongues must be interpreted or the speaker must remain silent. So Paul says, here's your guideline. I think it's great you all speak in tongues. I think tongues is wonderful. I wish you spoke in tongues as much as I do. Tongues is a wonderful way for you to communicate with God. But in the group, when you all get together, it must be interpreted. If there's no interpreter, the speaker must be silent. And here's the other major guideline. The second major guideline is 2 or 3 are to prophesy. Speak those words of encouragement. But the prophecies are to be monitored by the other prophets. And once again, one should stop speaking if the next one is ready to speak. And then we have the third guideline. And this is one we've never talked about before. No one could be disruptive. And one group that is specifically addressed next is the married women. Now that we've looked at it in context, we're going to read those verses. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. If we just read those 2 verses on their own, I think I should shut up and sit down. But when we read them in context, they make a little bit more sense. How do we interpret these 3 sentences? Well, here's one option, and this one has been used over the years. We could say that this is a binding statement for all time. In other words, women must not speak in the church ever. Blank statement, done, over with. Because isn't that what it says? It's disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. She's got to shut up. She's got to be silent. Is that really what Paul's saying? Do you see any problems with that interpretation? You're immediately eliminating half the group. And what did we just read in verse 26? Each one of you, right? Anything else? Well, any other problems with that interpretation of this being a binding thing for all time that women are just supposed to not speak? Anybody remember what it said in 1 Corinthians 11? Any woman who prays or prophesies. Kind of hard to prophesy if you're prophesying in silence. So it doesn't fit with other things that Paul has said just a bit earlier in the letter. Who were some of the key people who started Corinth with Paul? There's Chloe's brother. Chloe sent messengers. Yes, very good. And Chloe is a woman. How about Aquila and Priscilla? One of the very first leaders and teachers at Corinth is a woman named Priscilla. And often it's not Aquila and Priscilla, it's Priscilla and Aquila. That she's one of the major teachers. So we have a problem. And yet, for centuries, this verse has been used to basically tell women, sit there and shut up and be silent. So it's really important to look at context and to start asking questions. If you see something like this and bells and whistles start going off in your head, start asking questions. Does this limiting interpretation fit in with the rest of Scripture? No. How does it fit in with 1 Corinthians 7? Remember 1 Corinthians 7? Everything the husband could do, the wife could do. Everything the wife could do, the husband could do. The husband is given permission for his wife's body. The wife is given permission over her husband's body. Phenomenal stuff. Complete egalitarian stuff in 1 Corinthians 7. How does it fit in with verse 26? We already talked about that. Each one or everyone comes prepared. How does it apply to women who aren't married? Okay, it's been used as a blanket statement against women, but it specifically says to ask your husbands at home, what if you don't have a husband? What if you're a widow? What if you're single? What if you're a young woman? What about female slaves? It doesn't address female slaves, and yet we know that the church was very active and that slaves were flocking to the church because it allowed them an equal place. How does this fit in with example of other women in the early church? So immediately she would be saying, okay, so this is the way that it's been interpreted, but there's got to be something wrong with that interpretation. It just doesn't fit with everything else. So maybe there's another possible interpretation. Well, I got out some of the best scholars that I know, and they really disappointed me. Some Bible scholars say that it can be dismissed because it is a later edition and Paul did not write it. Now, actually, they've got some pretty good arguments, but it still bothered me that they took this line. But that's your next blank. Some Bible scholars say, let's just dismiss it because it obviously isn't from Paul. And they say because it doesn't fit his normal language, because it doesn't fit his context. Yeah, to support their argument, they say the language is not normal for Paul. It doesn't fit the rest of his open attitude towards women. In several manuscripts, in quite a few manuscripts, it's in a different spot. Some manuscripts put it here, some manuscripts put it at the end. So the theory is that it was a gloss. It was something written at the edge, and then it got inserted into different spots. Their major argument is this. There's a reference to being in submission as the law says. There is no law anywhere in the Bible that states specifically a woman must be in submission. Now some people say, well, yeah, in Ephesians 5, we're told that a woman is to be submissive to her husband. But we're talking 2,000 years ago to a church in Corinth who would not have had the letter to the Ephesians. So how are they supposed to somehow know of a law that was written to another church in another place? And besides, Paul didn't give it as a law. So people are saying, no, that doesn't make sense. So there is no law that states the woman must be in submission. Whenever Paul appeals to a law, he always cites a reference. Again and again and again, he will always say where the law is from. And there's no reference given here. So they're saying this is our key reason why we don't believe Paul wrote this. However, there is one flaw in their argument. This paragraph is included in the earliest manuscripts that we have. Even though it's in different places, it's there. And I don't think we want to get in the habit of just throwing out sentences that don't agree. So I don't like this argument particularly. So instead, let's stop and consider the historical and the cultural background and put the verses back in the context that we've just read them in. And when we do, there's another possible interpretation.